Welcome ladies and gentlemen, this is Mon, and in this guide, we're gonna go over the new best build in Once Humans Endless Stream scenario, the Little Jaws, which is an insanely overpowered weapon now that it has gotten an extra 20% damage buff. This was a heavily requested guide and here it is. So drop a comment down below for the guide you'd like to see next. Now starting with the weapon overview, hitting enemies triggers Unstable Bomber with a cooldown of 0.9 seconds. Unstable Bomber is a single instance of blast damage of 120% psi intensity with a delay of 0.1 second and a blast radius of 1.5 meter by default. The Unstable Bomber damage also decays over its explosion distance down to a minimum of 50% of its original damage. The additional damage is of blast element, it cannot crit, cannot strike weak spots, and will not decay over your bullet distance. Then, the Little Jaws has a 0.2 seconds of Unstable Bomber delay, so your Unstable Bomber will pretty much deal its explosion damage 0.2 seconds after you've triggered it. But this is for a good reason, because when you hit enemies that have an Unstable Bomber effect that's about to proc, each bullet hit will add 20% Unstable Bomber final damage bonus. And lastly, for every 0.1 second of Unstable Bomber delay, Unstable Bomber damage plus 15%, which means that by default, this weapon gets 45% Unstable Bomber damage bonus. That is, by the way, not linked to your mods and Cradle's Unstable Bomber damage bonus, which makes this bonus even stronger since it'll multiply with them. So this weapon is absolutely juiced up right now. But let me lay down the pros and cons of this build. Pros are that it has incredible single target damage, as you've seen from my damage showcase, and albeit its AoE isn't the best because of the 1.5 meter explosion radius, one of the secondary weapons that you can pair with it will cover that. So pretty much you will be able to handle single target content and AoE content with ease. Not only that, Unstable Bomber weapons have a special mechanic that allows them to bust shielded enemies very easily, as you've seen from my Light Dreamer clip. However, the cons are that this is an SMG, so it will be consuming more bullets than you might be used to. Not only that, but it will be much weaker against elemental immune enemies or enemies that have elemental damage reduction, since most of this weapon's damage comes from its Unstable Bomber procs. And in case you're wondering if this weapon is good for Endless Stream scenario, let me tell you, it is busted. All the damage showcases were done in an Endless Stream scenario, and it will do perfectly well against Endless Stream's enemies, such as Deep Dreamers and Light Dreamers. Now for the Little Jaws calibration, you will want to use Heavy Style for its important magazine capacity. This is very important for you to trigger more Unstable Bomber procs per mag, since if you went with something like Lightweight Style, you're pretty much going to be triggering Unstable Bomber 2 times per mag, and you'd have to reload, which is not really efficient for the Little Jaws. As for the Calibration substats, because Little Jaws deals most of its damage from its Unstable Bomber procs, you'll want to have a double elemental damage as Calibration substats. Moving on to the accessories, for the muzzle I'm using the small break for the important accuracy buffs that it gives. As for the optic, I'm using the compact reflex sight for some extra stability. Then I'm using the Cobra grip for even more accuracy, since this SMG just absolutely doesn't have any pretty much. And as for the magazine, I'm using the weighted SMG mag to prolong my DPS duration and to be able to proc more Unstable Bomber procs per mag. As for the ammo type that you're going to want to use, you're going to either want to use Blasting AP ammo, Suppression AP ammo, or Penetration AP ammo, depending on the type of content that you're clearing. Now for your secondary weapon, you have 3 choices. You have the Gulped Lure, the Bingo, and the Hazardous Object. But let's just go over one at a time. Starting with the Hazardous Object, you're pretty much only going to want to have this as your secondary when you want to have AoE clearing ability. So whether you're killing normal enemies in Nightmare Dungeons, or if you're clearing Deep Dreamers, you will want to use the Hazardous Object for its insane AoE clearing ability. Now, I'm not going to go through this entire paragraph, but essentially the way Hazardous Objects works is when you reload this weapon, you're going to throw the gun, and it'll deal a lot of explosion damage to your enemies, here at a scaling of up to 480% of your psi intensity. And to reach this much amount of psi intensity scaling, you will want to use Rapid Shot style calibration on it with double elemental damage bonus as calibration substats. Oh, and by the way, one thing that makes Hazardous Objects stronger for AoE is that its explosion damage does not decay within the explosion distance. So as you can see right now, on every dummy that the explosion is hitting, the damage is the same and does not decay. Now for the gulp lore, you're going to generally want to run this weapon when the content you're clearing gives you enough downtime to stack up the gulp lore's second feature, which is each enemy defeated reduces unstable bomber range by 10%, but most importantly gives you 20% unstable bomber damage for 30 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. And this is incredibly strong. This is what allows me to deal the insane unstable bomber procs. So one way you could easily stack this up, if you're doing silos for instance, is while making your way to the boss room, you just casually kill one enemy over here, over there, whatever. You just kill enemies along the way with the gulp lore, and like this you'll have the stacks. And by the way, you don't even need to necessarily kill enemies to get those stacks. If you're doing silos, you can simply kill the mysterious floating objects, which count as kills as well, and you'll get the stacks. Or even you can just destroy the explosion barrels, which also count as kills. So it's pretty easy to stack up the gulp lore's damage bonus effects. Now, albeit your unstable bomber damage bonus stacks last for 30 seconds, sometimes you might struggle to kill new enemies and whatsoever, or if let's say the stacks are about to run out, what you're going to want to do is use these very important ice cubes as they still count as enemies, and if you destroy them with the gulp lore, well, they will count as a stack, and you will either get new stacks or renew your stacks depending on if you're already at 5 stacks or not. Now, if you're wondering how to get those ice cubes, you're going to want to have the ice pod deviation. The ice pod deviation will craft those sticky ice crystals, and this deviation can be gotten in the Way of Winter server or in the Endless Stream server by simply doing this silo right here, the silo PSI divergence plus 0.5. And if you struggle to get the deviation, then I would recommend doing the nightmare mode, because the first weekly clear will guarantee you the deviation at level 4 to 5. One very important tip I have with the ice cubes is that, well, first of all, just for context, you might have noticed that they weigh a lot. As a matter of fact, one stack of sticky ice crystal counts as 10 load. So if you want to be able to carry more ice cubes with you, you're going to want to craft the SUV and the car, since you can store ice cubes in them. So the all-terrain vehicle has 12 slots, so you could carry up to 120 ice cubes with your SUV. And if you crafted... Okay, accidentally picked up my deviation, but if you also craft the car, you will be able to put in 80 ice cubes on top of the 120 ice cubes that you can put in your SUV. Now, if you don't want to deal with having to stack up gulp lore's effect, you can also keep it simple and only use the bingo. Essentially, the bingo will give you the bullseye effect on the enemies, which is 8% vulnerability for 12 seconds, and after switching to the bingo, the first hit is guaranteed to trigger the bullseye. So pretty much when you arrive at the boss room, let's say this is the boss, you spawn the maiden first, swap to the bingo, and then you shoot with the bingo, and then use your little jaws. Now, one very important tip to increase your damage even more is that sometimes the content that you're doing gives you enough downtime to stack up your gulp lore's effect, then swap to the bingo once you're at the boss room. And that can happen either with an unstoppable cutscene or with a delay for the boss's spawn time. So pretty much what you can do in that case is you stack up the gulp lore's effect. When you're at the boss room, you just swap to the bingo, and then you can benefit off of the gulp lore's effects and the bingo's effects. So what I would essentially recommend doing is you make multiple presets with the little jaws, at least one with the hazardous object, another one with, let's say, the gulp lore, and another one with the bingo, so you can quick swap between them. If you're unsure how to make presets, you just go in your gear tab, then you press H, and then here, after you press R, you can save whatever you're currently using as a preset, so you can quick swap. Now for the melee weapon that you're going to want to use will of course be the Kukri. The reason why is because when you defeat an enemy with a heavy strike, you will gain 20% psi intensity, and of course that's going to buff your unstable bomber damage by a lot. And how do you easily trigger this buff? Once again, it's going to be with those sticky ice crystals. You just throw one on the ground, and then let's say this is a boss right here. Essentially what you do is you just hold V, and that'll trigger a heavy attack on the ice cube. Moving on to your deviations, you have two options. You have the Shattered Maiden and the Mini Feaster. Now the best option is always going to be pretty much the Shattered Maiden. The reason for this is because if she locks onto an enemy that is not a great one, she will stun lock them, rendering them unable to do anything. And if she is locked onto a great one, she will heavily slow down that great one's movements. And not only that, she will increase their explosion damage received by 80%, which is a separate multiplier from everything else. However, there are two downsides for the maiden. The first one is she does take kind of some time to set up because after you spawn her, she has to slowly remove her helmet, then look at the enemy, then finally deal her damage and effects. The second bad thing is that against the elite in Theta, if you spawn her, she will just not do anything because she for some reason just can't lock onto it. But that's pretty much about the maiden. Now, if you don't have the Shattered Maiden, then of course you're going to want to use the Mini Feaster. Now, the Mini Feaster essentially will summon tentacles near enemies once every 1.5 seconds, and each tentacle summoned will grant you 20% status damage bonus up to a maximum of 80%. And so obviously here, the Mini Feaster is a weaker option. Moving on to key gear, if you're doing single target content, so if you're bossing against, let's say, a Light Dreamer, you're going to want to use the explosive front top. So it gives 0.3 seconds of unstable bomber delay, which, by the way, will increase your unstable bomber damage by 45% thanks to the weapon's last weapon feature. And since there's also more unstable bomber delay, it will allow you to hit your enemies for more time before the unstable bomber procs, which means that you're also getting more unstable bomber final damage bonus from the third weapon feature. So just from this first key gear feature, it's already really good, and not only that, it also gives you 30% unstable bomber damage bonus, which, by the way, counts as the same type of unstable bomber damage bonus given by your weapon feature, and does not count as the same one that you get from your mod substats and whatever, and from your Cradle perks Elemental Sense and Explosive bonus. However, if you're doing AoE content, so for instance, if you're clearing enemies in Nightmare Silos, or if you're clearing Deep Dreamers, then you're going to definitely want to use the Viper Mask and make a preset with it. Because if you're clearing AoE content, then you're going to want to have Hazardous Object as your secondary weapon. And the Viper Mask pairs perfectly with the Hazardous Object because Hazardous Object wants to deal lots of AoE damage, and Viper Mask gives it even more unstable bomber range. And not only that, for each 2% increase in range, you'll also gain 1% more unstable bomber damage bonus. And this bonus is also affected by your mod's substats. Before talking about the gear sets, I'd like to say that if you wish to see more Once Human content or guides, then do consider liking this video, subscribing to my channel, and turning on the bell for my video notifications. Now for the first and best gear set, this will be the low HP preset, which consists of 3 Treacherous Tides pieces and 2 Shelter pieces. The 2 Shelter pieces will give you 8% elemental damage bonus, and the 3 Treacherous Tides pieces will give you 50% weapon damage bonus, but most importantly, 50% status damage bonus. And to get those buffs, your HP will need to be below 70%, and you will need to have low sanity. And how do you do this? Well, you can eat a plethora of food items, but most easily these sanity corrosion capsules, which are unlocked via your mimetics in the logistics tab and in the electric stove. You'll see that here. You can craft sanity corrosion capsules on your stoves or kitchen sets, and they are very easy to craft. Each capsule costs 1 spoiled food and 1 boiled water. And with these capsules, ideally you'll eat them until your sanity reaches 0%, which here corresponds to 60% max HP reduction, so that you can also gain more damage, not only from Treacherous Tides, but from other sources of damage that require your HP to be lower. Now, if you don't want to play the low HP preset, you will have less damage, but you will gain in survivability with this preset, and that will be 4 Shelter pieces and 1 Renegade piece. The 4 Shelter pieces will give you essentially up to 38% elemental damage bonus, because the 3-piece effect will make it so that each time you hit an enemy, you will gain 1 stack of Deviant Energy, and each stack equals 1% elemental damage bonus. At the 4-piece effect, you can stack this all the way up to 30%. Now, reloading removes half of the total stacks that you've gained, but each time you hit a weak spot, you will gain 2 additional stacks. So even after a reload, you will still gain the stacks really quickly. Now for the 1-piece Renegade, we're using it for the reload speed bonus so that you have less downtime of when you're not dealing damage. The reason why we're not using the 2-piece Blackstone or even higher pieces sets with the Blackstone is because of its 2-piece effect, which is upon dealing elemental damage, you'll gain 1 stack of Warm Sensation, which equals to 2% elemental damage bonus, and you can only trigger that once every 0.5 seconds, and not only that, it'll reset every 2 seconds if you don't keep dealing elemental damage bonus. So only weapons that continuously deal elemental damage can make use of Blackstone. And here Little Jaws does not deal continuous elemental damage, so we won't be able to use Blackstone. As for the mask hide, the best mask hide to use is going to be Lucky Rabbit Fur for the 10% elemental damage bonus. Now I do know that it says after scoring a crit, elemental damage plus 10% for 3 seconds, but just to be very clear, you do not need to score crit hits in order to get 10% elemental damage bonus. So here, just to show it to you guys, I currently have no mimetics equipped. I have nothing except the little jaws and the shelter mask crafted with the Lucky Rabbit Fur. So currently, my stats idle are at 19.2% elemental damage bonus. And if I just hit any enemy once without scoring a crit hit and take a look at my stat sheets, you'll see that here I am sitting at 29.2% elemental damage bonus, and the hit was not a crit hit. Which means that for the Lucky Rabbit Fur, you do not need to score crit hits. Simple hits will count and you will get the 10% elemental damage bonus. And now for the food buffs, starting with the food slot, if at the end of your weapon rotation you end up marking your main enemy, then you're going to want to use the mixed fried hot dog for the increased damage against marked enemies. This is just the strongest option because this counts as damage against X-type multiplier, which is a multiplier you have the least amount of. However, if you're not going to mark any enemy, then you're going to want to consider either the popcorn or the surprise spring roll. Now for consistency, you're going to want to use the popcorn for the unstable bomber damage bonus of 10%. However, if you are using the low HP preset and you are fine with farming more, then you're going to want to use the surprise spring roll. The reason for this is because by default, if you eat this buff, you will roll between 5 to 15% elemental damage bonus from eating this buff. And not just that, you get double the effect that you had if your HP is at 40% or below 40%. I do know here it says the effect doubles if HP is below 40%, but here I have consumed the buff. It is unbuffed by the chef, so it goes from either 5 to 15%. And here I have a maximum HP reduction of 60%, which is the default one when you reduce your sanity all the way down to 0% if you're using 3-piece Treacherous. And here this is what I'm running, and I have no Cradle buffs. And if you take a look at my stat sheet, you'll see that I have 20.7% elemental damage bonus, which means that even at 40% HP, you are getting double the value of the original effect. So essentially, if you are using the gold floor as secondary and you are running the low HP preset, then ideally you're using surprise spring roll. But if you can't craft a lot of surprise spring roll to roll the higher percentage, then go with popcorn for its consistency. The reason why I talk about crafting a lot of surprise spring rolls is because if you roll the lowest percentage, which is 5%, it's just going to be no better than popcorn, even if it doubles the value, just by the concept of diminishing return and having more elemental damage bonus than unstable bomber damage bonus. Then as for the drinks buff, you're going to want to use the whimsical drink for the 25% status damage bonus, which will buff your unstable bomber procs. Moving on to your Cradle perks, I am currently in a non-novice scenario, so I'll go over those Cradle perks. So you're going to want Anti-Phase for the SMG damage bonus, and also for the Sniper Rifle damage bonus, as well as the damage bonus against phase anomalies. Then you'll want Tactical Combo for the 15% weapon damage bonus, of course Status Enhancement for the status damage bonus, then you'll want Elemental Sense for the Unstable Bomber damage bonus, you'll also want Explosive bonus for that as well. Then you'll want Marked Strike for the 20% weak spot damage bonus against marked enemies. And for the last two slots, you will want Deviant Energy Defense for the shield after you pull out your Cradle. And of course, Tactical Leap for the 20% damage bonus against any enemy type in the game, and for 10% damage bonus against their shields. Of course, if you struggle with survivability, then you could leave out something like Mark Strike for aerial suppression, which is 30% damage reduction against any type of enemy in the game. Now, if you have a keen eye, you might have noticed that the description for aerial suppression and tactical leap both say damage against deviants, or here it says damage received from monsters. But let me demonstrate it to you that it's not against only monsters and deviants, it's against any type of enemy in the game. So to simply demonstrate aerial suppression, all what we need to do essentially is to just jump. So the moment you are in midair, you will receive that damage reduction against any type of enemy in the game. However, as for tactical leap, it's a bit trickier. Only jumping will not allow you to get these buffs, and so there are a few ways to proc it. But essentially, one way you can do so is by unlocking the jump boosters, which is a level 5 to level 15 mimetic specialization. These are really cheap to craft, they have 5 uses each, and each use allows you to double jump for 30 seconds. Now the other way to get Tactical Leap's buff is by simply going over a big object, then jumping off and gliding for a little bit to proc the buff. So as you can see at the bottom of my screen next to my HP bar, I have 6 seconds of this buff, and of course you can just keep spamming to permanently keep it. And now to show that it is effective against any kind of enemy in the game, you'll see that here I have 20% damage bonus against vultures, Rosetta's deviants, and the same for their shields. Now lastly, for the preset where you have hazardous object as secondary, then you're going to want to remove Mark Strike and apply anti-coherence because it gives pistol damage bonus and will also give you damage bonus against coherence anomalies. Now for your mod Suffix and Substats priority, starting with the weapon mod and the mask mod, you're going to want to go with keyword suffix, here being unstable bomber. And the reason for this is because you're going to gain more from unstable bomber damage bonus from its fixed attribute than if you went with talent suffix due to diminishing return. But very importantly as well, you're going to want to have unstable bomber range and blast damage bonus as linked attributes. Now unstable bomber range isn't really that important if you're only spamming pro and you're only dealing damage to the end boss, since you wouldn't really need range as range is used for AoE clearing. But definitively if you're AoE clearing, and especially if you're using hazardous object, then you're going to want to focus on unstable bomber range as linked attribute. And of course, as general attribute, look for damage bonus against X type depending on the type of content that you're doing. If you're fighting Deep Dreamers, I would recommend getting mods with damage against normal enemies until you're fighting the elite boss, which by then you would ideally swap to a preset containing damage against elites. And if you're bossing, then you would want to have damage against great ones. Then for your helmet and top mod, ideally you're going to want to go with lunar suffix, and the reason for this is because lunar suffix mods give double the bonuses of what talent suffix give. But if you don't have a good lunar suffix mod, then it's perfectly fine to go with talent suffix. So for talent suffix, they are limited at 8% elemental damage bonus and 6% status damage bonus, whereas with lunar suffix, you are limited at 16 and 12. And even if you're like not super low HP, let's say at 70% of your HP, you are already gaining more with a lunar suffix mod than with a talent suffix mod. Then for your pants and boots mod, the ideal mod to go for would be downstar suffix. The reason for this is because albeit their base values are the same as talent suffix, so here you can see elemental damage plus 8 and status damage plus 6, if you are in a visual wheel server, or if you're fighting enemies that are standing at a lower level than yourself, so for instance, you're just like 5 meters higher than them, you will gain extra damage bonus. So for elemental damage, you can get up to 12%, and for status damage bonus, you can get up to 9%, whereas with talent suffix, you are still stuck at 8 and 6. And of course, with downstar suffix, don't forget to have your mods also roll into damage against X type, depending on the type of enemy that you're facing against. Then as for the gloves mod, there is still not a special suffix, so of course you're forced to go with talent suffix with status damage bonus as linked attribute, and you can either use a mod with 2 linked attributes, so for instance status damage bonus and magazine capacity, with only 1 general attribute, so 1 damage bonus against X type, or you use a mod that only has status damage bonus as linked attribute and has 2 damage bonuses against X type of enemy in the game. Moving on to your mods, let's start with the Little Jaws mod. And here you have actually 2 choices essentially. You have Bombardier Souvenir, which is when triggering Unstable Bomber, automatically refill 10% of your magazine. And your other choice would be Supercharged, which is triggering Unstable Bomber, grants Unstable Bomber damage plus 5% for 3 seconds, and this effect can stack up to 6 times. Now if you're bossing, and the enemy dies before you even deplete a single mag, then you're going to want to use Supercharged for its increased burst damage. However, if the enemy takes multiple mags to kill, then you're going to find better results with Bombardier Souvenir, thanks to this mod being able to extend the amount of time that you're doing damage, and over time, you will end up doing more damage with Bombardier Souvenir. It's really just that if the enemy doesn't take that much time to kill, so for instance, if it's somewhere in between taking a lot of mags and dying in 1 mag or 2, the performance between Bombardier Souvenir and Supercharged are very similar, and will only show significant differences after multiple mags have been depleted. You don't really want to use Reckless Bomber with the Little Jaws because Reckless Bomber gives you unstable bomber damage based off of your current crit rate, and you're not building crit rate on Little Jaws, nor will you really want to use Heavy Explosives because Heavy Explosive doesn't really increase your damage, and it only allows your weapon to stagger enemies, which in any case with the Little Jaws, you wouldn't be staggering a lot of enemies at a time. Then, for your secondary weapons mod, let's go over all 3 weapons. So starting with the Gulp Lore, the best mod to use is going to be Supercharged to grant you extra unstable bomber damage bonus if you continuously shoot with the Gulp Lore. The reason for this is because if you were to go with Reckless Bomber, you're gaining almost no bonuses because you're not stacking crit rate on the Gulp Lore. You also won't want to use Bombardier Souvenir because the Gulp Lore does not have enough magazine capacity so that when you trigger Unstable Bomber, it actually refills bullets. And lastly, for Heavy Explosives, well, you're not using the Gulp Lore to stagger enemies, you're just using it to kill enemies. You're going to want that damage bonus coming from Supercharged in order to kill them quicker. Then for the Bingo, it's going to be Vulnerability Amplifier to add an extra 8% vulnerability, so an extra 8% to all of your damage. Then for the Hazardous Objects best mod, funnily enough, it's going to be Reckless Bomber. And the reason for this is because no other Unstable Bomber mod works well with Hazardous Object. Heavy Explosives Stagger effect does not trigger off of Hazardous Throw. It only procs from weapon hits, which you never do with Hazardous anyway. Then, Bombardier Souvenir is useless as well, because each time you throw the weapon, its magazine capacity is automatically refilled back to full anyway, and Bombardier Souvenir refills your mag once you trigger Unstable Bomber, which in that case literally makes the core effect useless. As for Supercharged, it's the same logic as with Heavy Explosives. Unstable Bomber procced by the throw do not count as Unstable Bomber procs for this mod. Only Unstable Bomber procced by weapon hits do. So we're using Reckless Bomber ideally because at least you'll get 4% Unstable Bomber damage bonus, since Hazardous Object has a base crit rate of 8%, and Reckless Bomber gives 0.5% Unstable Bomber damage bonus per 1% crit rate. But of course, this 4% bonus can be easily offset by better substats on another weapon mod, so still keep your substats in mind. Then, for your melee mod, it literally doesn't matter because you're not using the Kukri to deal damage, you're only using it to destroy ice cubes, but I'm currently using Melee Amplifier just for the fun of it. Moving on to your helmet mod, your only option is going to be Deviation Expert. It does reduce your range by minus 25%, which really doesn't matter because most of your damage doesn't come from your bullets, but rather, you want this mod for its fire rate, which will allow you to squeeze in more bullets before Unstable Bomber goes off, which means that you will gain more Unstable Bomber final damage bonus amongst other damage bonuses as well. And not only that, this mod gives you 20% status damage bonus, which is very important for your Unstable Bomber damage. Then for your mask mod, you're going to want to use Delayed Blast. Its effect is before the bomb explodes, for every 4 hits landed on the enemy, your Unstable Bomber's final damage will gain 25% final damage bonus. And if it's not already obvious enough, with the Gulp Lore, you have a lot of Unstable Bomber delay, which allows you to synergize perfectly with Delayed Blast. Now, even if you're, let's say, using Hazardous Object, you're still going to want to use Delayed Blast, and the reason for this is because, well, there's not really other mods that work well with the Hazardous Object for the Mask mod, because the other Unstable Bomber mod is Pinpoint Strike, and the effect is when Unstable Bomber hits only one enemy, you gain 25% final damage bonus for your Unstable Bomber that you're pretty much only using to hit a lot of enemies at once, and obviously, you'd be gaining nothing from this core effect. So once again, even if you don't gain anything from Delayed Blast, you will still want to use this mod when you swap back to your Little Jaws, and also for these substats. Moving over to your Gloves mod, here you have 2 options. You have Elemental Overload, and you also have Status Enhancement. And here the choice will depend on whether you have more status damage bonus or elemental damage bonus. So for instance, if you have less status damage bonus, you're going to want to use Elemental Overload. And especially if you're using the low HP preset, you should have more status damage bonus than elemental damage bonus, so you will definitely want to use Elemental Overload if you are using the low HP preset. Then moving on to the shoe mod, if you're using the low HP preset, Rush Hour is what you're going to want to use. because with the low HP preset, you will permanently gain 24% weapon and status damage bonus due to Rush Hour's core effect, which is every 10% HP loss grants 4% weapon and status damage bonus. Now, if you're not using the low HP preset, then you're going to want to use Covered Advance. Its core effect is either less conditional or straight up gives more buffs than all of the other options, as its effect is taking no damage within 4 seconds, grants 20% weapon and status damage bonus for 30 seconds. Then for your top mod, just use any gold mod that has the best substats for you. Now here I am using a Lunar Suffix mod, but even if you don't have Lunar Suffix mod, you still want to run a gold mod for the Talent Suffix. Then lastly, for the Pants mod, this is where it gets slightly trickier. Now if you are doing AoE content, then you will easily want to run Elemental Resonance, because its effect is every elemental damage dealt from the previous magazine, the next magazine will gain plus 1% elemental damage bonus, which means that obviously you're going to hit a lot of enemies with each Unstable Bomber proc, so you will be able to max this mod's effect out. However, if you're bossing, then you won't want to use Elemental Resonance, because with the Little Jaws, you will not be able to proc more than 10 explosion per magazine. And here's where you're going to want to use 2 other mods. So let's start with the Precision Charge. Precision Charge's effect is for every 10% weak spot hit rate of the previous magazine, you'll gain 4% elemental damage bonus, stacking up to 24%. And this will obviously be the mod that you want to run if you're bossing and the enemy has easy weak spots for you to hit. Because obviously, if the weak spots are easy to hit, you'll be able to stack up to 24% elemental damage bonus. However, if the enemy doesn't have any weak spots and it's a boss, so you're only facing against one enemy, then you're going to want to use Abnormal Increase, because its effect is when the magazine is empty, you gain 10% status damage bonus for 12 seconds. Now the effect can stack up to 3 times, but because of how each mag takes quite a while to unload, your bonus with Abnormal Increase will go between 10 to 20%, which will be more than if you were using Elemental Resonance or Precision Charge against an enemy that doesn't have easy to hit weak spots. But this is it for this guide. If you've made it this far, consider liking the video, subscribing to my channel, and turning on the bell for future notifications. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. This is Mon, peace out.